They need something more than being a member of the world community, a child of the whole earth. And they feel that the liberal national ethos is taking away who they are. It's taking away the core of their identity.
I can't ignore the way Christians have treated immigrants throughout history just because I have a few nice Bible verses and ways of interpreting them for today. Hello and welcome back to the second to last episode on Christian nationalism. And this is a very special episode because it's all about immigration policy, which is very relevant to nationalist discourse. Nationalists always have something to say about immigration and immigration policy. And this episode is also about a book that I've recently published, co-authored with Professor David Elcott of New York State University. So we've invited David Elcott on the show, and Austin interviews both me and him on our book on the significance of religion in immigration policy. So this episode is all about what the book says and what we hope the book will achieve in shaping the way politicians and faith leaders think and talk about the role of immigration in nationalist discourse. I hope you enjoy listening. David, thank you for joining me and Austin to talk about your and my book.
Right?
And so the book's called On the Significance of Religion in Immigration Policy, which I have to say is not a really exciting, grabbing title. But we didn't have a choice. It's part of a series called Religion Matters. And every book in the series is on the significance of religion for such and such, climate change, democracy, whatever. And so we had to make the book fit into the series. What were some of the distinctives that we had to do in this book? Do you remember, David?
Well, it needed to be comparative. They didn't want a single story. They wanted some sense of the vitality of various ways that faith communities are dealing with the issues of immigration, particularly in light of the fact that immigration is an issue all over the world, whether it's Buddhists in Myanmar, Muslims in a number of countries that don't allow you to actually become a citizen if you're not Muslim, Christian in Europe and America, Jewish in Israel, Hindu for sure in India with its Muslim minority. So one is they wanted to feel more than just an internal conversation of any one particular religion. I think that was one piece of it. The other is they wanted it to be contemporary. They wanted it to speak to the moment. At the same time, we felt, and I think that was well within the mission, to argue that contemporary policy actually, ironically, some ways scaringly, can trace itself back hundreds, if not thousands of years. So in particular, Christianity and Judaism, both which are at 2,000 plus years in the making.
Interaction, yeah.
So both of them have much to say about how you look at the other. I think an additional point for us and for this series of which we were a part is that it's not to speak to an academic audience, to one of these books that will get, if we're lucky, 7, 10 citations in some obscure journal, but rather to think in terms of how could the story we're telling, how could that help inform both policymakers as well as religious leaders as they think about their role in the issues of immigration, and perhaps even a third audience, which is the lay audience of people who are people of faith who are thinking about using their religious values to speak to the issues of immigration. I don't know, Barney, I think that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's not just an academic book, although it hopefully will be of service to the academic community as well. But it is meant to be read by people on the field, as it were, whether they're actually in politics, in government, or whether they're leading churches or religious communities of some kind. The thing is, we don't have to sell the relevance of this topic right now. It's a book about immigration and religion, and like I'm used as an academic, I'm used to having to like big up why my book is really, really important. My book on, some obscure French philosopher who nobody's heard of and what they have to say about negation or something. But you don't have to do all of that in this case. Like the book will sell itself as regards its relevance. We just hope that what we're actually saying is informed properly by our traditions and fairly represents the diversity in our traditions as well. Because there's another point about this book, is not meant to be us just giving our own opinions on what we think the right immigration policy should be from our own religious perspective. We rather should do justice to all the different positions on immigration that all different kinds of Christians and all different kinds of Jews have. That's right, isn't it, David?
Yeah, and I would describe it kind of in our work in this way. So first off, I've been writing about the nexus of religion and politics and society for a long time. I've been deeply immersed in this both professionally in the work that I did and also in my writing. And here is the reality: theologians try their best to keep away from the real world. Like we don't want. I mean, yes, we can get a Martin Luther King. We get to, but basically, theologians want to stay in the realm of theology, and not necessarily in its application. So, for theologians, for writers of religion, they're going to write about what the religion says, not necessarily what the practitioners do. Political scientists, on the other hand, and social scientists in general, will glob together. They'll talk about Protestants, they'll talk about Catholics, they'll talk about Jews or Muslims without really calculating, trying to understand the diversity within those communities. And they'll use statements of political figures who use religious language as if that is describing the faith community.
I think at the beginning of the project, I came across to you as a bit too much like that theologian removed from the real world, didn't I? Like the beginning stages of the book, I had these nice, neat little explanations of what the Bible says about immigration and what Christianity teaches. And your challenge to me, David, was, yeah, but does any Christian actually in politics act that way, right?
Yeah.
Do you remember some of those conversations?
Yeah, no, for sure. And you, to your credit, you stepped back and said, if we're going to write this book, we need to write it in a way that somehow can bridge the written word, the beautiful theological statements, and the reality out there. And I think part of our focus was to recognize that religion is not simply about belief. It's not simply about the spiritual experience, but religion, and I think we're seeing it all over the world, I think I can put it in a context, is about identity. Somehow it's talking about who I am. And if it's doing that, then religion is going to merge with other parts of me in very complex ways. And in my own research over the years, long before this book, when I was doing research around the United States with all different faith communities, it was very complicated to know, is the religion determining, affecting the political views, or are the political views really now tailoring what parts of religion people are going to accept, because their identity is not simply, I am a Christian, I am a Muslim, I am a Jew, I am a Hindu. It is, I am a Christian who's living in this world with this political reality and these needs and this sense of who belongs and who doesn't belong in my world. And that's not new, ironically, when we think of, well, the text that I used to start was from the Bible, from the story of Joshua and the story of the book of Deuteronomy, which sound like they're antithetical, because one says you need to treat the stranger in your midst like your own. to embrace them, to care for them, because you were a slave in Egypt. You know what it is to be oppressed. You must therefore care for those most vulnerable in society, particularly those who don't have an identity of the identity of Israel. Then you've got the other side, which is wipe them all out. If they're not one of us, kill them all. So we're talking about, that's 2,500 years
Just for
ago.
reference, that's Deuteronomy chapter 20 is the second reference, and the first reference is Leviticus 19.
And here's the scary reality. Much of what Israeli policy is based on one read of that very text, that Bible. And what we saw in the case of the Jewish community of the United States was a very different choice of biblical text to use to explain behavior. And I think that Barney was finding the same reality to have to deal with. And I would tell you, in looking, I happened to, my area of research initially was the Muslim world. You'd find it there, you'd find it there as well. And even Buddhists, I feel very grateful, by the way, that we are equal opportunity bigots. That even the gentle Buddhists, are murdering and assaulting Muslims in Myanmar and Hindus in Sri Lanka. So we get to see it everywhere in the world.
It's a kind of very gritty and honest starting point of the book, is confronting that opposition sometimes of opinion within basically every religion has this sort of diversity of opinion. And as you said, David, the problem is sometimes what's in the driving seat here. Is your first allegiance to a political party, and then you shape your faith and your interpretation of your scriptures to fit that political party? Or is it the other way around? Is your faith leading you to support one particular political party? And it's very hard to know. But either way, those on one side of the debate will have their favorite Bible verses that help them and support their argument, and they will explain away other Bible verses, and you'll see the exact opposite thing happening on the other side of the debate.
Mm-hmm. And even the same text. I mean, we had Matthew Rowley on this podcast in a previous series, and he showed how the Puritans would use.
He wrote a book about religious violence.
Yeah, and so the text would mean one thing in one context, and the same Puritans would read the same text in the opposite way in a different context, right? Because the sort of political reality has changed.
One of the great quotes is the Battle Hymn of the Republic, which as a kid I sang with great, vigor, this wonderful story of fighting, until I kind of looked at the words, as he died to make us holy, let us die to make us free, as God goes marching on. Or thinking about the nice Jewish composer who writes God Bless America, right? That who am I and who belongs in my community is so fundamental. It's in our DNA. We have to assume that way, way, way back, now we're talking 50,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago, you see somebody coming toward you and you got to make a determination. Friend or foe? Is that person going to kill me, or is that person going to be a friend? And scary as it sounds, we have not progressed significantly further. And I think that Barney and I would argue in the research that we did and the writing the book, we're actually writing of 2025, and it doesn't feel all that different when you listen to the words spoken, the feelings, the emotion, the sense of loss, the sense of exclusion and inclusion. You feel like, wow, we're only the beginnings of evolution.
Yeah.
Fully.
And what's interesting about the way you put it there, you said, who am I, who belongs in my community? You didn't say whether you were talking about a political community or a religious community or a national community. And I think one of the main insights from our research is that the whole question of religion and immigration turns on how people construe their identity in terms of national identity versus religious identity, and how far those two overlap, so that I see who I am. So I see my national identity as part of my religious identity, which means that people who don't belong to the same religion as me shouldn't belong in my country.
Well, or at least we'll be more modest to say, oh, they can be in our country as long as they know their place, long as it's in. When I first began writing, and I noted that the flags of Iceland, Norway, Sweden, Switzerland, Denmark all have crosses. And then when I would speak to Europeans and interview, they go, no, but that doesn't mean anything. And I'm going, right. That doesn't mean anything at all to have a cross as your national symbol. So
this is a Jewish, right? It's a kind of a Jewish perspective that, because from a Christian perspective, we look at those countries and we think, oh, there's rampant secularization. Those countries are barely Christian anymore. There's a small minority of faithful Christians hanging on, but the country as a whole has abandoned Christianity. But from a Jewish perspective, you're saying that's not really the case in many ways.
I'm saying it's stronger than that. When a Swede thinks about what is Swedish, the celebration of Easter doesn't have to have anything to do with resurrection to sit with your family to celebrate. Christmas doesn't have to do anything with the birth of Jesus to have a sense of meaningfulness that is national. It's our culture. Even though, as you said, Barney, it can be devoid of any overt Christian meaning. That's the irony in the case of Europe. I would say that in Israel, you had a similar circumstance. The early founders of Israel were absolute secularists. They were Marxist secularists. There were poems written about youth, man, reject your father, daughter, keep the memory of your parents forever gone. We are a new generation. And they even would interpret, as a kid in Israel, I went on the Seder, on the Passover Seder, and I was on a kibbutz of a family member, and they were serving breaded pork chops, right? We can't even begin to say where that doesn't belong, but the idea of Jewish as meaningfully Jewish as an identity was not nearly as important as socialist, as Marxist. And Jewish was entirely, a political claim, but it wasn't true. It wasn't true. Underneath all of that was, we are building a Jewish country. And therefore, what we have seen, of course, over the years, as we've seen in other countries, that the fusion of the national identity as being deeply Jewish, even though Israel, nobody thought of it not being a Jewish country, but the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, had to pass legislation to declare, that we're only talking a few years ago, that Israel is a Jewish nation. And therefore, to do that, it had to diminish not only Arab Muslim culture and Christian culture, but actually remove Arabic, which is the language of 20% of the population, not to even speak of the areas occupied. They had to diminish it by making it no longer a national language, right? So we're seeing this around the world.
And you've got to ask, this is both religious and political at the same time. You can't separate the religious and the political in some of these concerns. And yet, when we talk about who is my community, you could mean, if you're a Christian, you could say my identity is a Christian, so my community is the church. The church doesn't need to have any territory or any land or any borders in order to be the church. You can have Christians in every country. But what happens if a bunch of Christians say this territory belongs to the church or to Christianity, and then we need to keep non-Christians out because this is a Christian nation? You see that sort of slippage from an identity that is purely religious. It starts to take on political dimensions quite quickly.
Yeah, well, I did have to, though, push on this point as we were thinking this book through. Years ago, I was at the Vatican. The Vatican and the World Conference of Churches was having a conference on conversion. And what really it turned out the conference was about, it was about why Christian missionaries are being attacked in various places around the world. And I was listening to the explanations given. And finally, I said, well, is it possible that there is some resentment there that the church, both the Catholic Church, but then Protestant churches, were colonial imperialist powers going in and forcibly converting in every continent in which Christians imposed themselves? And you should have seen the reactions of, no, we are not, we only brought Christ to the world. I'm going, right. So I think that even my point with Barney was, even within the bastions, the holy bastions of the Vatican, of the World Conference of Churches, there was a National Council of Churches. I did note how, for example, the Presbyterian missionary map of where the various missionaries are looked remarkably like the British colonial empire in its heyday. So I think that it became increasingly clear that Christianity has a long history of its political engagement. Jews, of course, have a much shorter history, but no less absolute in the ways that it responded in the
Well,
established.
David, I mean, one of the things that you forced me to do in the writing of this book is to confront some of the moments in Christian history which are uncomfortable and which I wanted to avoid. I remember I wrote the first draft of my chapter on Christianity and immigration, and you really didn't like that draft. You really didn't like it, but because you said, I've completely ignored the way Christians treated Jews and expelled Jews from various European countries in the name of Jesus for hundreds of years. And I was like, well, I've ignored that because I don't think they should have done it. And you're like, well, but they still did it. It's one thing, you were like, it's one thing for the Pope to say we should welcome all immigrants and love all immigrants and all that kind of stuff. But if it doesn't make any difference to the way Catholic politicians in Catholic countries define their immigration policy, then it's irrelevant. I mean, you put it very strongly, and we can talk more about whether that's true, but that was what you said at the time.
It's very, just a funny story aside. I was in Chefchaouen, Morocco, and Chefchaouen, Morocco was founded by Muslim and Jewish exiles from Spain, from the expulsion in 1492, which didn't only expel Jews, it also expelled all Muslims as well. And they established this town that is gorgeous and looks exactly like an Andalusian town. And they established it in the turn of the century, the end of the 1400s, beginning of the 1500s. And until the 20th century, no Christian ever entered that town. 3 tried. The first 2 were killed. The third was forced. He tried to pretend that he was a Jewish Hasid and was forced out of the town as well. So you can feel, and there it is, that's history alive 500 years later. I do want to note, to Barney's point, though, in which people of faith can, in fact, be incredibly supportive of immigration, and that the words of religious leaders really can matter, which is a significant point of our book. In the United States, where Jews are a minority, we tap much more into the experience of exile, of oppression, of submission to the religious forms in which we live, and that America was meant to be a haven. And I think Barney can speak a little bit more about where America is now. But when my family fled Europe, they fled Europe because the United States was uniquely meant to be a nation of immigrants and of enormous diversity. So that overwhelmingly the Jewish organizations in the United States were strong forces for immigration reform, for being sensitive to the role of the immigrant, because from the historical experience of being immigrants ourselves, and therefore taking exactly those texts that would support caring for the immigrant. That doesn't mean that there are Jews who have the opposite view. Unfortunately, we know that by the main architect of Donald Trump's virulently anti-immigrant policy is a nice Jewish guy who, ironically, whose own family fled Nazi oppression to come to the United States, right? And they were actually protected and saved by the United States that took them in as immigrants, and only for him to become the whose name shall not be uttered, right? Um, um, that he becomes this virulent architect of
Yeah.
anti-immigrant policy.
I mean, that's the thing about writing this book, which, as you say, it's contemporary, but it also has some history. There is a strong history of support for and welcome of immigrants, but in the name of the faith, with the faith as the basis, running all the way through. I mean, there was that movie that came out last year, Cabrini. Saint Cabrini is the patron saint of immigrants in the Catholic Church, and she was in America working tirelessly to support and provide for Italian immigrants at a time when Italian immigrants were ostracized and persecuted and seen as second-class citizens. There must be like equivalents today. I don't think Italians are treated that way anymore in America, but they were treated back then. And there's this long history of great welcome and support of immigrants running alongside the slightly darker history of expulsion and exclusion of immigrants at the same time. And both of them at least claim on the surface to be motivated by their faith. And I said in the book, like, we're not going to judge whether that really is the motivation, because that's not for us to judge. Like, it may be that people are using faith as a guise for pure power motivations or whatever, but that's not the point. The point of this book is to say, what religious reasons are they giving for their activity, and how do those help us understand the effect of that religion on global politics and on the particular country's immigration policy?
You know, one of the painful things, particularly in the United States, is that it is an immigrant population. The Italians, Greeks, Irish, Catholics and Orthodox Christians, but let's say even the Catholics, which was the major immigration, when they came to this country, they weren't considered white, which does tell you an additional layer in the United States.
I mean, we didn't talk much about race in this book, actually, because it would have made it 3 times as long.
Race clearly was an issue, and the ethnic minorities, Italians and Irish in particular, how as the issues of race loomed larger, were suddenly embraced in the white Christian community to bolster the presence of whites. But part of, for me, the great sadness, whether it's anti-immigrant Jews or Latinos who is this idea that, this image of seeing the person getting off the boat and climbing down, getting to the dock, turning, looking up and saying, why are they letting those immigrants into our country, those aliens into our country? So part of, again, what we're seeing, what we're experiencing is this navigating of who belongs and what criteria belonging. So in the United States, the combination of race and religion, and if you take Donald Trump's preoccupation with Northern Europe, as opposed to Latino Catholics and evangelicals, who are, the Catholic Church in America would be significantly smaller if it weren't for the immigration of so many from Latin America.
I mean, that's the funny thing about America, in that with all of the resistance to immigration in America going on right now, religion doesn't play as much of a divisive role as it does, say, in Europe, because the immigrants are normally some kind of Christian as well, and it's Christians trying to keep other Christians out, or whatever. And that's why when I wrote not a whole chapter, I wrote a large section of this book on America as a case study. And David, you told me initially that it shouldn't really be in the book because it's not about the religious other. And I made the case that it is still about immigration policy motivated by religion and using religion as justification. So it's in the book now. But you pointed out that, in Europe, it's Christians trying to keep Muslims out, and there's a real religious other there, which is a different story.
And now Jews, because of what's happening in Israel and the policies of the Israeli government in destroying Gaza, it has now made Jews much more vulnerable in Europe. Once again, as we just saw in the United Kingdom, where there was an attack on the synagogue. In Israel, because I'll talk to the specifics of Israel. Israel allows anybody who fit the criteria, ironically, the Nazi criteria of who is a Jew. They use that exactly as an immigration policy.
So they use the Nazis' definition of who counts as a Jew in Israel.
Yeah. In other words, if you had a Jewish parent or grandparent, or you were married to a Jew, right, then you could come to Israel as an immigrant and receive citizenship almost automatically, right? Whereas if you did not have that descent criteria, then it was incredibly difficult, if not often impossible, to gain admission. So you could have Ethiopian Jews, those who were designated as Jews, brought to Israel from Ethiopia, Eritrea, the area there. But if you were Muslim or if you were Christian and you came as an asylum seeker and crossed the border on Sinai into Israel, you would have no chance of becoming a citizen. So they could come from the exact same place, in a sense, both of them asylum seekers, but the rigid criteria in Israel of who is a Jew, right, and therefore who can belong or not belong, is sacrosanct. And as the Muslim population, by virtue of birth or by virtue of areas that Israel incorporated in the areas it conquered in 1967, and because the immigration from the Soviet Union of well over 1 million Jews included many who were not Jewish any longer, or they were the spouse of, right? So actually the only place where Christianity was growing in the Middle East, ironically, was Israel. But as the percentage of Jews dropped in Israel, the panic over who can be a citizen and who belongs rose.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting. Your comment about the kind of criteria for who counts as a Jew reminded me of Tommy Orange talks about this a lot with Native American communities in the U.S. Right, that the U.S. government has a way of defining who is Indian, and then certain tribes have sort of adopted that or fought against adopting that because it fundamentally changes their kind of sense of identity and how the kind of community structure works.
That's actually beautiful because you're now it has nothing to do with religion. It doesn't even have anything to do with race. And yet how crucial identity is. And I think that in the case of Native Americans or the case of Jews, you would argue, well, they're a minority trying to sustain their minority community in the face of a majoritarian Christian population. But then we see Christians in America, in spite of the fact that they're the overwhelming majority, feeling that same sense of identity loss, that same sense of threat against them, or even, or more so in Europe, So clearly there's something so much larger happening here. And to flip a little bit in my own work and research, perhaps we're finding that liberal democracy, the values that I would say I cherish about inclusiveness, about building bridges, the kumbaya of all the races and religions, gender identities, holding hands and dancing together and singing kumbaya, that vision is not satisfying so many of so many in the world. It's just not enough for them. They need something more than being a member of the world community, a child of the whole earth, that they're grounded in a certain place at a certain time within a certain complex of relationships, and they feel that the liberal national ethos is taking away who they are. It's taking away the core of their identity. Well, if that's the case, what's going to satisfy? Well, this nexus of religion and nationalism, right? This coming together of, well, my nation and my religion are really the same, becomes so important to an identity that, and it's so, and by the way, we would argue heteronormative, that
But that's an explanation. It's not a justification, right? You're not saying that it should be one way or the other. But what you're saying is that there is a way of understanding why so many religious nationalisms are on the rise in various parts of the world, is because people find a sort of watered down globalism, cosmopolitanism, an insufficient way of grounding their identity, an insufficient way of having a self-understanding of who you are. It's not good enough just to say I'm a citizen of the world. I need to be
Barney,
something else than that.
I think our book addressed that by saying to religious leaders, you know what? If this is the reality of what's happening in the world, then you've got to pull your sleeves up and enter the fray and make an argument that Christianity or Judaism, and of course we would extend it to any other faith community, that you've got a role to play in how people are going to perceive themselves. And that they're not, that it can't be that the only voices that speak for religion is a tele-evangelical or or the Prime Minister of Israel or the Prime Minister of India, right? That we can't, or the Marie Le Pen, ironically, who speaks with such Christian fervor, not behavior, but Christian fervor, that they can't be allowed to be the only voice. And I think one of the values, the real values of what you've done in looking at Christianity in Europe and the United States, and what I've done, but generally the thesis of the book is there's been a terrible imbalance, that the people who could speak about religious identity that is inclusive and not exclusive, that, to use the language I would use, that to believe that your absolutist faith is the only way to be in the world and everybody else is an apostate, if not satanic, that's a form of idolatry, right? That we have to be modest. God's is unknowable. And to claim that we're the only ones who exclusively know God, this is now coming, I'm not saying Barney has to agree with me on this, but
well, we haven't agreed at various points throughout the writing of this book,
that we all have a piece of the understanding of God, God's presence, and what God demands in the world. And I have to have the modesty to know that the moment that I say I have absolute knowledge of God and what God wants, I think that is the idolatry that the Bible is most concerned about. It's not worried about some idol. It understood that it's not the form that matters. The Bible, the authors of the Bible, they understood that it is far more significant that Pharaoh believed that he was God, that he was the absolute truth, and that they really challenged that as they challenged Jewish kings who made that claim. And if I could say the Jews as a minority in the world, as a minority, that was the role they often had to play, because they were in systems that were demanding absolute fealty and allegiance. And they had to say, just one moment, we're still here too. We can't quite buy that.
Yeah, and to your point about religious leaders need to stand up and say something and not just let politicians make use of religion for their own political ends. I think we can see one moment recently when that actually happened, which is when the Vice President of America, J.D. Vance, quoted some theological Latin on Twitter and got 11 million views when he's talking about this, the ordo amoris, which is, he calls it this Christian principle, which says you love your neighbors first. You know, you love your family, then your neighbors, and then your national community first. And then if you've got any love left in you, then you can use a little bit of it left over for the immigrant or for people outside of your country. And all of a sudden, like every theologian I knew had written an article, was publishing on blogs, analyzing this use of the Ordo Amoris in J.D. Vance. And the ironic thing about that was I'd already written the book by that. The book was with the publisher at that point being reviewed. And I had to go back in and add a couple of sections talking about, I'd already written about the Ordo Amoris. I already had, you know, a section discussing the role of the Ordo Amoris. And I had to completely change that section because I had to say, oh, J.D. Vance used this and then incorporate. But what we did see in that event was a moment when religious leaders and theologians got a chance to step in and speak authoritatively on the question and say, not all of them said that J.D. Vance had misunderstood the Ordo Amoris. Many of them took the side of J.D. Vance, but it was at least a debate that they were entering into. And that was your point, David, that's what they should be doing.
Yeah. And I would say the same in the section on theology. I noted that the greatest thinker in the medieval period, Maimonides, was of two minds. On one hand, he said, basically, the only reason you should allow a non-Jew into the land of Israel is if you need him to do something for you. And then turned around and said that the overarching principle of Judaism is mipnei darkei shalom, is the language he uses, is for the sake of the paths of peace. And he then argued that not only is a Jewish community obligated to feed, to clothe the non-Jew, even in his case, the idol worshiper, but that they're actually obligated to bury in a religious fashion of the person who died. They're obligated to bury that person as well because they can't do that themselves. And all of this is mipnei darkei shalom, for the sake of the paths of peace. So here you have, you can feel this tension that is not, and I think we tried to be honest in our appraisal. I think both of us believe immigration, there should be a reasonable immigration policy that is not based on any particular racial, ethnic, national, or religious identity. But we tried to be fair that this is a struggle. And I guess that's the point I was making, Barney, that I have to be empathetic, more than sympathetic. I have to be empathetic for those who feel that what they understand to be community, what they understand to be communal identity is being torn away from them. And when they try to assert that sense of identity, they're called deplorables. They're called rednecks. They're called, people mud eaters. I mean, I can tell you the language, that I in my reading, the language that describes these people. And I want to be. It doesn't mean politically I won't fight against them, but I do want to better understand them. And I think that we have to find a way to do that, even when I know that politically I'm going to do everything against perhaps the stances that they would take. But to recognize there's real suffering and hemorrhaging right now. And it's not only coming from the progressive liberal community. It's coming from a sense of who I am is no longer being respected and honored in the world.
And for me, I think that, especially in American context, I just see that communities, their sense of identity has been hollowed out in part by politics, right? And so this division is sort of like your identity, if you're going to hold it together, has to be a political one. And the left is kind of giving, like genteel neoliberalism, and the right is sort of, increasingly offering like this, like, let's get riled up. This is who we should be. We can be this. And I think for me, it's like, well, religious leaders have a serious responsibility to say neither of those are your identity, right? Like neither of those are actually Christian identities. And why has this, or Jewish identities, or, these other, like, why religious identities seem to me to have been hollowed out so much that other things have to fill in the vacuum. I don't know if that relates to anything you say in the book, but
Austin, I'm going to say that I think Barney and I, what we wrote, would challenge what you just said, because what you just said was it's all about politics and religion needs to enter. But I think what Barney and I showed in the book is no, it may be about religion, and politics is reflecting certain religious views. It is so important that we don't say it's about politics or it's about religion, but that we really explore the ways that this comes together. And I think that Barney and I really did that in this book. We really pushed to not make it, we're political scientists, or we're theologians, no, we really pushed to say, you know what? If you're a political leader or you're a religious leader, you need to look at these texts, to look at these traditions, to look at the historical experience and recognize its complexity and utilize that to try to make responsible, both politically wise and God-fearing decisions.
I mean, part of the problem is that the word religion is so flexible and malleable that you can make it mean the superficial veneer that is being used by politics, or you can make it mean that deeper level sense of identity that is actually driving politics the other way around. And I think, in a sense, both can be true at the same time, just depending whether you're talking about religion as a given set of principles or beliefs, or whether you're talking about it as identity or behavior or a spiritual quest for meaning, or any of these different things. It plays a different role in every case. And yeah, I think we do try to make the case in the book that you can't ignore religion when you're thinking about the immigration policies of almost every country in the world, pretty much. There may be some exceptions, but the countries that are in the news at the moment, the countries in North America, in Europe, in Asia, they're all being, religion is deeply bound up with the decisions that are being made policy-wise for or against accepting more immigrants. I should also say that you can often make it sound as if there's only two sides you can take on this. Either you want all immigrants in your country, or you don't want any immigrants in your country. Either, and in some ways that's ridiculously simplistic. I don't know anybody who would welcome every single person, even if they were a terrorist or whatever. And I don't know anybody who would exclude every single person. There's nuances and there's balances, but we had to write the book the way we did because we had to follow the contours of the debate as it actually goes on in national and international politics. And it very often tends towards this kind of, you're either talking in a pro-immigrant way or you're talking in a more restrictive, put up the borders way. So it can be a bit simplistic the way it looks, but underneath there's deeper roots and deeper levels to it.
As Barney said, it's important for political leaders to understand the role that religion and religious identity plays. But I do want to remind us, it is important for religious leaders to think when they speak and write and think about the text that they use. What could seem internally to make perfect sense, when put out there, can have very, very different implications. And I think that we are, is equally important to us, that a faith leader cannot stand in the pulpit and speak only internally, as if the conversation only is within Christian conversation or Jewish or Muslim conversation. But they have to recognize that the words that they use matter, and they matter outside in the world, and the way that they will be applied. In the most horrendous story of a Jewish man who reads the book of Esther on Purim, on the Jewish holiday of Purim, walks out of services and murders 29 Muslims in prayer because he just read how Haman and his whole family and all of the Persians who were going to kill the Jews, they're all murdered, right? I've got to own that as a Jew. I've got to own that he read the same text that I read on Purim.
That story's in the book. You use that story as an example there to recognize
But I've got to own that, even though it is for me the most repulsive, horrendous, as opposed to saying, oh, he's not Jewish because he did that. I've got to say, wow, I have to think now, can I ever use that text the same way as it was used? 1,500 years ago, when Jews were, a fractional minority, oppressed minority, it was kind of a fantasy to read that. Wow, Jews could have that power. Well, now that Jews have that power, we have to rethink entirely the way we use those types of stories. And I think that really is where Barney and I were pushing. We were really speaking to two different audiences. The people of faith and the political world. And we're saying, you guys really need to know each other, and you need to be responsive and think about and reflective of the way that your views are informed by and have impact on the other.
I'm curious to know for you, what is the main audience of the book? I know you've said that it's for a lot of people. Do you feel like you're speaking more to policymakers? You're speaking more to religious communities? How does this going to speak to the people you're hoping to reach?
Oh, Austin, we're authors. Everybody in the world should be reading this.
That's right. It's for everybody.
I really tried to write it with both communities in mind, to be honest. I tried to write it in such a way that somebody without any religious background or knowledge would not only understand what was being said, but perceive its relevance and its applicability to their own work. And similarly for people in religious communities as well, certainly for Christians. I tried to step out of the academic theologian genre that I've written most other things in, and tried to be led by the language, the terms, and the conversations that are going on in the news and in the world of international politics, and just shed light on that from the theological perspective, try and show what sorts of theological moves are being made by these things. So I don't want to come down on saying it's mainly for this audience or mainly for that audience.
Yeah, good. That's helpful.
Yeah.
My other question is, I think, for thinking about sort of how you approach it, it sounds like, David, you do, a kind of qualitative, quantitative research and these kinds of things. I know Barney comes more from a kind of theological, theoretical perspective. Are you both sort of merging both of those things, or how did you approach sort of capturing what's going on in the world today?
I do consider myself a theologian, but Jewish theology is different from Christian theology. When I was at a...
This is one of the debates we had to have many times.
I was at a Vatican conference in Latin America, and the cardinals and bishops there were speaking very eloquently with deep Christian theology. And I said, let me explain something. Jewish theology is carnal. It's about the food we eat. It's about what is done to my penis. It is about what prayer I say going to the bathroom. It is about history. That is Jewish theology. There is no word for theology in Hebrew, in biblical and in rabbinic language. We don't function that way. And therefore, and of course, it was very shocking. They were a little bit, my using this language wasn't exactly what was expected in a conference of theologians. But it's to be understood really differently. So for me, I have always made the claim, as I did in the book, that theology is lived. Written theology is very sweet for a circle of people, but you will find very few Jewish theologians, and that includes Maimonides, Nachmanides, and includes the rabbis of the Talmud. They are very, very much responding to the lived experience of the community to which they're speaking, and to the community in which they're trying to explain themselves. I would say the same with me. I'm very much writing to the community of which I am a part, to understand how and what it is that we are doing. In fact, my next book, after this book, I said there's another book that I did with my wife, which it's called A Sevenfold Path, a traveler's guide to Jewish wisdom. And very much, you'll see right there, it is, the theology is there, but the theology is going to be told in the lived experience of people and the stories they have to tell. So I think,
and this was one of the differences that we had to wrestle with when we were writing the book. David wasn't entirely happy with the way I was writing, as if from a sort of timeless abstract perspective about what the ideal Christian ought to do with the ideal immigrant. And you kept trying to bring me down to saying, yeah, but what did actual Christians do with actual immigrants in history? And it's not as if I came completely around to thinking about it the way David does, because I'm still a Christian, and I admit Christians do theology differently, because Christians see the implied foundations of all of the practical action. The practice always arises from some sort of an implied theory. But I was forced to take more seriously what had actually happened in history and how that might inform and affect what I think ideally ought to happen or should happen. I can't ignore, that was the whole point of what David was saying. I can't ignore the way Christians have treated immigrants throughout history just because I have a few nice Bible verses and ways of interpreting them for today.
Poor Barney had to deal with the fact that one wing of my family was expelled from Spain in the end of the 1300s and fled, and my mother had to flee Germany. And I'm a first generation American. So yeah, he had to deal with the Inquisition, and he had to deal with the Holocaust.
Well, that's the thing. It gets personal. Interreligious dialogue is hard. This book was supposed to be an exercise in interreligious dialogue about a concrete, practical topic like immigration. And there were moments when it was hard. There were moments when we just didn't agree. And there was even one moment when it looked like the book wasn't going to go anywhere because we just disagreed so much. But we pushed through, we persevered. And my conclusion is, interreligious dialogue may be hard, but it's also worth it, and it can happen, it can work. You can change each other, you can actually come together on stuff.
And actually do things that are good in the world. And wouldn't that be wonderful, that religion would be known for the goodness that it does in the world and the compassion that it does, and not be known as the source of violence and destruction. We are in a liminal moment in world history. And if we can't do both what Barney and I had to do interpersonally in writing, and do what the book is trying to present of creating a consciousness in decision making, both within the faith communities and within the political world, we are suicidal, and it is terrifying. So I think we both write this from a passion that our faiths need to be contributing to a wholeness, and not being the source and scene of such negativity in the world. And I think that is strong in the book, without even having to take sides, saying this is the only way to view this issue.
this was a great discussion. Thanks for joining my podcast, David, and talking about our book that we wrote together.
Super.
And it'll be available for free if you download the PDF, or you can pay $100 for the hardback, whichever you prefer. So we'll put a link to that in the text for this podcast. Thank you for listening to Faith at the Frontiers, a podcast that confronts challenges to the Christian faith with hope. If you liked this episode, then do subscribe to hear more like it in the future. For now, goodbye.